like, okay, everyone has asked me, like, what do your adoptive parents think?
Right.
And I'm stammering through responses. Like, I saw my adoptive mom a week ago, and I had a huge stack of my new book, which she knew about. And I thought, well, she's going to ask for a book, or this is the moment I'm supposed to be like, Mom, here's my book. And instead I chickened out, and I did not give her the book. And she didn't ask about the book, and then the book came out, and I've been on all the newses. And I have to imagine she's seen me. The Vancouver Sun was delivered to her front door, and I was on the front page. She got there, she saw. But I haven't heard from her since. And
what's your book called?
My book is called Invisible Boy. Oh yeah, I have a microphone too. My book's called Invisible. Oh my God, my book is called Invisible Boy: A Memoir of Self-Discovery. It is about my transracial adoption. But yeah, I guess like I'm stammering through these responses because I don't know whether or not people are, or I don't know whether or not my parents are ever going to speak to me again. And so I guess I always want to know, like other adoptees who have written their story, like did you come to terms with upsetting your parents? Did you?
Well, I've been coming to terms with upsetting them since childhood.
Yeah.
So a memoir is just a cherry on top of a Sunday of not disappointment, but of chaos, I guess. But I often answer that question. Thank you so much for having me on the panel, and thank you to the festival. Thank you to the library. This is wonderful. I often turn the question back on the questionnaire and say, well, no one ever asks me how my Korean family feels about this. And like part of the reason that I think so many adopted people want to or feel the urge to write stories or counter narratives is because these the story of adoption is often told through the perspective of or by centering mostly white adoptive parents. And so I take it as an opportunity to draw attention to that, that my white Canadian parents feature very smallly, that's not a word, very little in this book, and say, well, no one's asked me how the actual subjects of this memoir feel about it. And that's my Korean family. So I usually do. And then it guilts them into like backing off of it.
I didn't realize that I could just volley the question back to them. That's a good idea. Like, well, how do you feel about it, etc.? Should we, let's formally begin our event. My name is Harrison Mooney. And like, I'm just blown away to be sitting here with Wayde Compton. Wayde Compton is a celebrated poet, historian, and the foremost proponent of Black literature in Vancouver as the editor of the first comprehensive anthology of Black writing from BC. His nonfiction book, After Canaan, Essays on Race, Writing, and Religion, region, was shortlisted for the City of Vancouver Book Award, and his first work of fiction, The Outer Harbor, won the City of Vancouver Book Award. Wayde is the former director of the Writers Studio and the South Bank Writers Program at Simon Fraser University Continuing Studies. He currently teaches in the Faculty of Creative Writing at Douglas College, and according to his Twitter, is also writing a memoir, apparently. Is that the memoir about transracial adoption? Oh man, I'm so excited to ask you about that. And then to my right, oh my God, Jenny Heijun Wills, 2019 memoir, older sister, not necessarily related, won the Hillary Weston Writers' Trust Prize for nonfiction. It poignantly records the untidy family life that unfolds when Wills travels from Montreal to Seoul to find the biological parents who gave her up for adoption in her infancy. Braving heartbreak and the risk of forever losing her way, Wills journeys through the emotional terrain of home, bonding, and belonging with exceptional poise. Writers' Trust jurists Ivan Coyote, Trevor Harriet, and then Joshri Thapa call it finely observed, meticulous, and candid, stating that this memoir offers its subjects no easy redemptions, only the chance to grow together towards greater understanding. Jenny Heijun Wills, oh my God, thank you so much for being here. Wow. The name of this panel is Transracial Adoption. Is it any good? I don't know if anyone here has seen Review, this weird Comedy Central show about a guy who, he says, life, it's literally all we have. but is it any good? And then he reviews life experiences, and I always just thought it would be really funny if one of them was transracial adoption. You know, at the end he was like, transracial adoption, I give it 2.5 stars. And yeah, I mean, you know, it's, I think that I'm always looking for levity in these difficult conversations. I mean, you know, I've written a book that tries to take seriously my own interiority while also making light of it and pointing out that the world's pretty dumb. And I think that that's often the conclusion that transracial adoptees come to, like this whole system is pretty messed up. So the first question I want to offer to either one of you, and it's just huge and loaded, is the question that is the title of this event, transracial adoption. Is it any good? Wayde, Jenny, do you like it? Would you recommend it? Would you give it 5 stars?
Me to go?
I would do want you to go.
Is this on? Check. Well, for me, I don't know if I am transracially adopted, because I'm mixed race, black and white, and it's funny what you said earlier is what the assumptions people in terms of centering white adoptive couples. Most of the time, when I tell people that, when I go that far, they assume I was adopted by white people, and I wasn't. I was adopted by a mixed couple. So my dad was black and my mom was white, and my biological parents were the same, more or less the same racial reflection. So that wasn't a fluke. That was clearly, when I've gone back through my papers and the chronology of how things worked out, I was. My birth mother decided to put me up for adoption while she was still pregnant. And then I was born on January 20th of 1972. And my parents had applied to adopt in early January, and they had me in their home by the end of the month. So it was fast-tracked through because the social worker saw mixed baby in Vancouver, mixed couple. We got to make this happen fast, right? Which was the right decision. But also very fluky. And a lot of this essay that I've written about my adoption and going back through the papers and stuff is realizing how incredibly fluky that was in a city like Vancouver. My experience was 1 in a million. Like, that really was a strange coincidence of time and people. And anyway, so is that transracial? I don't know what you call that, transracial or racially contiguous adoption, or I don't know. Some term I don't think exists for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm blown away by your adoption story, and you know, like I said to you earlier, I'm jealous. I mean, you had a black dad, and it seems like he was socially aware, and he gave you you know, tools and strategies for being black in the world. And I mean, I don't know how you feel, you know, Jenny, but like, yeah, I mean, like, would having a Korean dad as an adoptee have made things different for you, do you think?
I certainly think having Asian people around me would have made things very different. Having met my Korean father, I'm not sure so much about that, but that's just a personal thing. And I think that it's important, as I think Wayde's commentary has gestured to, is that we're thinking about like systems and industries, not just sort of like necessarily individual experiences, because this question, is transracial adoption any good? What we're actually asking is the adoption industrial complex any good, right?
Yeah.
So to quote my colleague, Kimberly McKee. So I mean, I have my personal opinions about whether I think transracial adoption is good on a large scale, also on a small scale, and it's flexible the way I think about it at different times. And that's because there are personal examples that I've seen that makes it harder to make those sort of like hard statements necessarily. But in the spirit of what you folks have all come to see, no.
Yeah. I like a strong response. That's wonderful. Yeah, I think about, when I was looking into my own adoption, I found a bunch of news articles from the 80s where, people were talking about the shortage of healthy white babies and how, as a result, a lot of white families who didn't necessarily want a racialized baby were kind of settling for that. And that's how I got adopted. And I realized looking into some of the literature that, in Canada by the 70s, social workers were already arguing that you can't just throw a baby into any old family. You should be considering the racial makeup of that family. And, in my private adoption, that was fully rejected. It's just, no, we're not going to do that. We don't see color. It's racist to even think about it. And so as a result, I was raised by, a white family that just had no context for being Black in the world. But I really am blown away by your experience of being fast-tracked into a family that had a similar racial makeup to, I guess, what you would have experienced at home. And the reason I want to talk about that is, I know that people are going to ask me, can we make transracial adoption better? Or will adoption be improved if, say, we just consider the racial environment of the child? And I feel like as you start to write about this, I have to imagine that question comes up for you as well. Like, do you think that that your experience as an adoptee is better? Like, do you think it's a better way to do this? If this practice continues, which I imagine it will, would you say that that's something that should be considered? Yeah.
Yeah, first, I'm not really like a policy expert or anything like that, but so to have in all seriousness, I have a very subjective point of view, as we all do, I think. But doing the research, it was pretty intriguing. Like doing the research from the 60s and 70s. I was adopted in 1972. So doing the research around that time, it was interesting to see that was policy. They were trying to match, babies in the system racially as best they could, right, as closely as they could, most of the time, except when it came to Indigenous kids, right? And in that case, it was, it's hard to see where the policy is exactly, but in the practice, it seems quite clear that it's an extension of colonial policy of assimilation, that they want to place Indigenous kids with white families or have no compunctions about doing it anyway. But then other things emerge too that are interesting, like just that, speaking of it as an industry or as policy, that, unwed white mothers of that era were pushed to surrender children, right? So, but the reverse was not true for women of color who were not Indigenous. They were not pushed to surrender children. There was an idea that, they could just have kids out of wedlock and that's fine. Like, we don't really have a policy push to get them to surrender. So there's an institutional racism there in the system. And then with Indigenous kids, this whole other category of assimilation. So there's like three different things going on racially demarcated through that period. So that's fascinating. But coming up to today, it's something I don't have a lot of experience with because I'm from 50 years old. I'm from the era of lock-closed adoptions. They were not just closed adoptions, they were meant to be eternally closed, right? So I would never have access to any of this information or ever meet my birth parents ever. And that leads to certain things like lies in my adoption papers. Like they fudge things, I think, because they're thinking, well, he's never going to find out kind of thing. So that's interesting. But to me, the idea of open adoption seems like a far more humane thing. Like that's a much better concept than maybe especially so for racialized kids to have some kind of contact throughout or possibility of contact even. And then I know there's some programs, I know just specifically in the Black community, but I'm sure in other communities too, There is some support now, and I've had friends who've done some volunteering as like Black adults with Black kids who are adopted by white parents so that they can match up with them in a kind of big brother, big sister type situation, which sounds fantastic. To me, that sounds like a great. I think anything that brings kids into the community or brings them into contact with the people who've had some of the experiences that they're going to have seems really valuable.
Yeah, Jenny, did you experience, growing up in Korea and your family's white, and like, were there any attempts by your adopted family to try to plug you into, their vision of Koreanness?
I don't think my parents wanted to think about race, and what I think, one of the things that I think distinguishes all of our experiences, or my experience here, is that I was transnationally adopted as well. And so when we talk about plenary adoption, closed adoption, open adoption, I think that sometimes people go towards overseas because they think that there's a guarantee that it's a closed adoption as well. But the sad thing is that even when one has the small chance of meeting one's first family, no one can live up to the myth of what someone has created in their mind. And when culture and language barriers enter into that fray, then it also complicates things. And we have things for Korean adoptees. I've seen them like around that sounds similar to what you're describing, Wade, like culture camps where you go and you eat like kimchi and then you like make a origami, because it's also like very Pan-Asian, because they're not that like, they're not like really that focused on cultural learning and like all of this. But it's still an uncomfortable thing, at least to see, because it's like a snapshot of maybe what second or third generation, in my case Korean Canadian experience, would look like. But I'm a first generation immigrant, and so there's a complicated difference that happens. And when I met other Korean people when I went to college, for instance, the divide was by then already too big. It was too broad a gap to overcome because of language and cultural differences. It's just.
How have you worked to bridge that divide? I was just telling Wade, I've worked recently to just kind of like expand my circles and try to change my friend group, and try to make sure that the people I'm hanging out with aren't just like all white people that I've gotten comfortable with, like as a result of my very white upbringing. So recently I was like walking down the street with like 3 Black friends, and it was like the first experience of walking down the street like a group of Black men, and it changed things for me, and it even just it seemed different. Like it seemed like people were a little bit more nervous about us, and I said to them, and I was telling you, Wade, that it was the first time I think that I've ever been like pretty far from the door, and someone came out like, "Can I help you guys?" But I think I avoided that for a long time because I felt like such an outsider, and I felt like people could tell, and they'll hear my voice and just my mannerisms, and they'll think, well, this isn't a real Black person. And so I would avoid spaces where that part of me would be exposed. And I mean, I have to imagine that you had similar experiences, just trying to manage your Koreanness, but also understanding that other people would be able to see that you were different.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
How did you manage that?
I think this is one of the reasons that I was so drawn to literature in my 20s at the moment when I was trying to figure those things out, because when you're a transracial adoptee, you're that, very visibly in public when you're a youth and you're with your family or whatever. But then if you go to college or if you're away and not next to your adoptive kin, all of a sudden you're just like a person of color. And for me, that really happened in my 20s. And I tried to reach out to different communities and did sort of fail in many ways. But then I turned to literature as a way to secretly learn about my own culture and also, adjacent cultures in the Asian diaspora. And that's where the entry point was for me, because it was too frightening to do it publicly. And the fear of rejection, was like even more exacerbated in that situation. But books and poetry and some memoir, but a lot of fiction was a way to learn in secret how to navigate the world as it saw me, I guess.
Wade, what was that like for you? And again, like I'm just so mindful of you having a Black dad, and like my dad he was just so clueless about everything, and I know that your dad like pointed things out and gave you strategies for how to be Black in the world. Like, did you ever feel that same anxiety? That your Blackness wasn't real, or that you were kind of standing alongside this identity that you were supposed to be doing quite well. How was that for you?
Yeah, I did, but I don't think it had anything to do with adoption. I think it was the typical thing of being mixed race, very light skinned Black person and being from Vancouver. But that stuff, anybody from Vancouver who's mixed and whatever would have that same experience. So it didn't have to do with being adopted. So because my home was culturally reflective of who I was. So that wasn't a thing. It was more about Vancouver being mixed.
Wade, I wanted to ask you just about kind of your journey talking about adoption, because I know Jenny's an old pro at this. You got all your canned answers.
I feel like that could be rephrased.
In a way that flatters and honors you, yes, I'm sure it could, but it's too late now. I'm kind of new to the space, and I'm still getting used to the questions people ask, and working on my own canned answers. But yeah, you're really new to this space. You've got an essay that you recently wrote. It's still kind of in a draft phase, as I understand it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I've been writing and publishing since the 90s, but I've never written about my adoption before. I've written about it. I've never published anything about it. And, just to be frank, my dad died in 2012, my mom died in 2019, and that's the only reason why I'm going to publish something about.
Can I ask, like, when you say my dad, my mom, which dad, who are we talking about
My
here?
mom and dad.
Yeah, okay, and that's another thing I want to ask you guys, like, you're older, you're more successful, but I just feel like you've had more time to work with the language of this. While I was writing my book, I thought, okay, well, and there's my mom, and that was my adoptive mom, and then I was like, I don't know if I want to call her my mom. Like, maybe I'll call her my mother. And then I started spending more time with my birth mother. And I thought, okay, well, now she's my mother. And then for a while, when I was talking to friends, I'd say my mom or my mother, and they'd be like, who are you talking about? And it always feels weird for me to add the qualifiers, adoptive mother, birth mother. Like my kids are really great about, when I talk about my mom, they kind of know which mom I'm talking about, and they also understand that I have two moms, and it's like not confusing for them. But it took a while for me to kind of change the idea in my mind of, when I think of my mom, like, who do I picture? Do I picture this white lady? Do I picture this Black woman? Like, I wasn't sure. I've made that transition now, where when I think of my mom, I think of Trinika, who is, my birth mom, my real mom, my true mom. But all of this language just feels so weird. Like it feels, I just kind of had to make a choice for clarity. And sometimes when I'm talking to people, they'll be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, which mom do you mean?" I'm working towards a question here. I think it's just like, how did you manage the language of it? Birth parents, adoptive parents, my mom, my dad. How did you decide who gets those honorifics? And why?
I mean, for me, it just feels completely absurd to qualify my mom and dad as adoptive. It seems like a weird violence almost, actually.
Mm.
Those are the people who parented me. Those are my mom and dad for my life, right? Up until my 20s. And then I met my birth mother. I've never met my birth father. So to call him my real dad is bizarre. It seems utterly bizarre. I actually find a bit from an interview with Jackie Kay. Jackie Kay is a Black Scottish poet. I think she's the poet laureate of Scotland, actually, although they call it something different. The Maker.
The Maker.
Yeah. But basically, the laureate of Scotland.
The Maker.
Yeah, I think it's Macker. It's not like the word. It's a Gaelic word, I guess.
Irish pronunciation.
Scottish.
Since
it's Scotland, yeah. But anyway, she was adopted at birth by a white couple. And she, talks about an interesting thing that people will speak of when they find out she's adopted, will speak of her birth parents as her real parents.
Mm.
And she says, well, that's completely backwards, because when I was little and I knew I was adopted, I had my parents who were the ones who were here. And then I had my imaginary parents who I imagined, who I had not met. And so it's a weird reversal to suddenly flip that and say the ones that were imaginary for me are real. So I just don't qualify my parents as anything but my parents.
Same question to you. Like, how do you manage this?
Thanks. That's a great question, because it's one thing in everyday life, but it's another thing in a book, because there need to be recognizable characters for a reader to, I think, understand who's being talked about. And we can use the different literary devices and tricks at our disposal to make it evident. I wasn't trained as a creative writer. I'd written a couple of poems before, but my background was scholarly, and I wrote my PhD thesis on adoption stories. And so I was aware of how quickly the terminology is constantly changing in critical adoption studies, and how people talk about different members of the constellation. But it's also a very personal thing, as Wayde says, that is up to the individual and how one feels about that. In my book, I stuck with Korean mother and Canadian mother, which is odd because I also have weird thoughts about nationalism. And I think that family is the first form of nationalism that we're taught as youths, when we're told these are the people that belong, these are the people who don't belong to our group, these are the people to whom we're loyal, etc. And so it's a little bit of a weird compromise, but I didn't know how else to signal, because my story is one about reunion, or post-reunion, I should say. And so I do need to distinguish between those two characters, like four characters, like mom, dad. But also I want to say that there are other families who have multiple moms or multiple dads, and many ways of kinship construction. So it's not solely an adoptee or adopted person's experience to try to think of ways to address their kin, I guess. That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think sometimes about I have some friends who have a kid, and it's like the most complicated family setup. Like there's like a couple that they're kind of uncles, and then they're using like non-binary. They're like Tio and Zio, and then there's and they, I guess someone is an ex of theirs, and they are the biological parents, and like the understanding for this child is that they have like four parents, and yeah, for me, like I I was so locked into the idea of like a nuclear family, and you got one mom and one dad, and my parents were locked into that, and it felt like, well, I can't even refer to my other mom as my other mom. I'm only supposed to have one of those. And so I've just kind of been working through the idea of having, a more complex family, a larger family, and just growing my idea of who I'm related to and who I'm connected to. And I guess I wonder for both of you, like as you do that and as you kind of grow in your idea of who you are, like have you faced resistance from family, from adopted family, at all, to the idea of just kind of adding more people to your lineage, to your heritage?
So heavy. My arm is shaking. It's so heavy. It's so foul.
Powerful microphone.
Well, like I said, I wouldn't have written it while my mom was still alive. I think it just, my dad was sort of okay with me looking for birth relatives. He seemed to be fine with it, which is kind of typical of him. He was much more easygoing. My mom was pretty, much more prickly, much more difficult person, and quite insecure about the idea of me looking for birth parents. And so it was, we never resolved it. It was something I did it anyway. I went and looked for and found my birth mother and my sister. I have a half sister. And
did that feel like a betrayal? I'm asking because I need to go to therapy, but I really felt like connecting with my birth parents was a full-blown betrayal of my adoptive family.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it felt it did and didn't. There was half of me that just felt like this should be obvious to my mom why I would want to look for biological ancestry, right? Or why I'd want to know, who these people were. So that's just, everybody understands that, I think, right? But it wasn't about understanding it or not. It just hurt her. She was very insecure about it. She was very scared of the idea of being replaced or nudged aside or whatever. I know all of the reasons for it. And despite me reassuring her, it never really penetrated. So we just stopped talking about it. I just wouldn't talk about it. And weirdly, though, that almost made me disappoint in principle. She was very open to my sister and very kind to her and invited her over and that kind of thing, but had a wall between the idea of my birth mother being in my life was just something she could not handle. And so the reason I wouldn't have published anything about this until now, after she's gone, is just I wouldn't want to hurt her. It would hurt her very much, I think, to read this, even just to know that I was, even though I don't think there's anything bad in it about her, I think it just would upset her greatly and hurt our relationship. So that's the reason why.
How about you, Jenny? Was it fraught looking into your biological history? Were your parents supportive? Were they resistant? I'm going to give you this microphone and see what you say.
They were, my parents were a little bit resistant, but I'm quite persistent and very bratty. And so at first it was like, oh, we don't have any information. And then it was like, oh, but also here are the names and social security numbers. But I was living away and I moved out at quite a young age, in fact, to go to school. And I was living in the US at the time. So it was, I was close to 30 when I started my birth search for my first family. And it happened very quickly, locating them, like too quickly for me, in fact. And my parents were worried about me, reasonably so, right? But they became less resistant as I became more consistently and firmly Korean in myself. That it became difficult for them to say, well, we're not interested in Korea or Korean people, because I started to say, well, that's the most important part of my identity at this stage of my life. And so I think they were afraid that they would lose me altogether, that would be the loss. My parents met. My first family and my adopted family have met. So like the parents met, it was a whole thing.
Yeah, no, tell me about that.
I don't want to.
Okay, moving on.
It was a little bit uncomfortable, and similarly, I think to Wade, your situation, my mom was, I think, a little bit more sensitive to the situation. My dad, I don't want to say he wasn't sensitive, that's not fair, but he didn't express it the same way that my mom did. And I was kind of frustrated by the situation. So I wanted to be there when they met, but they just like snuck around when I was like distracted by something and introduced themselves. So I didn't even bear witness to my parents, like all four of my parents meeting one another.
Oh, I'd be so mad about that.
It was a little bit, I was sad because like those are some of the most important people in my life. And I wanted it to be like a cool family like thing, and they were fine with one another when they met, but I didn't get to see it. So I'm a little bit sad about that.
How did you find the confidence to just do that? To just be like, I'm Korean now, like, this is my identity. Deal with it.
Guess what, guy?
Yeah, no, I'm serious, right? I'm a coward at heart. My family is very scary, and it took me a really long time to just kind of work up the nerve to be a Black person. So I think that. I'm blown away when I hear that you just I'm going to be this person and you have to deal with it. Like, how the hell did you get that kind of self-actualization? What'd you do?
That's way too much credit, first of all. But again, like I always want to bring it back to like the books or like the cultural texts that were so important. And, I met Wei-Sin Choi, whom I know.
Who is that?
He was a Chinese-Canadian author, a fellow queer person, but also an adoptee. And he was intraracially adopted in Canada and wrote a memoir about that in 2004, right? So I met him, and he was like, no, you should write about this, and you should have the confidence. And I was couched in my studies, and that gave me the confidence, I guess. I felt like there was an army of Asian people around me, even if they were characters in storybooks or other authors that I vaguely knew. It gave me some sort of confidence. But I was always I was very bratty. I was always resisting them as a child, like for one reason or another. So I don't think it surprised them.
Yeah.
And I was just like, by the way, now I'm Korean. So, surprise.
Wade, when you've just kind of just now started writing and talking about, your adoption. I believe this is your first event where, that's what the topic is. Why now? And actually, beyond that, why? Why do you want to talk about your adoption?
Well, I think, I sort of said why now, but also just, I write essays all the time, so I'm always sort of writing essays, and this was one I've tried to write a few different ways, and I've been a fan of Jackie Kay, who I mentioned in particular, a fan of her poetry, and then she did a memoir maybe 10 years ago, I guess now, about her adoption. And that got me thinking of ways to write about it. And some of the interviews with her, I do that thing where, when I read a book by somebody, then I'll go and find every interview I can with them, and she's so smart in talking about adoption and just, and Black identity and mixed identity and national identity and all of those, how all those things converge. She's so smart about it. that I felt like these are bits of theory that are helpful ways of thinking about it. And it just got it churning in my head, right? And so I think I was just thinking about, and I was very, very much fixated on how to start. I mentioned that to you before. The hardest part was figuring out where to start, because that's just true in conversation. Because I'll find all my life, I would start talking to someone about my origin or whatever, and I explain my parents and their family is my family, because it is. Then every once in a while something will sort of has to be clarified that I'm not blood related to them though. And then the person I'm talking to will be like, wait, what are we talking about then? Like, I thought you were, and then I'll have to start again and say, well, I was adopted. And then like, you're adopted by white people. It's like, no, I wasn't. And explain the whole thing. Like the black dad I'm talking about is the dad that adopted me. They get very confused. And so where to start my story is just complicated. It's always been very complicated just telling my life story to anyone.
This is the beginning of your essay, which again, I know is in draft phase. This is so good. You should just just drop it from helicopters or something and make sure. Do you think that could you read just the beginning part there?
Yeah, and that'll show you what I mean about where to start. So I don't know, I'll only read this is only about a couple minutes to read it. So in a 2007 interview with Eleanor Wachtel, the Afro-Scottish writer Jackie Kay said of her experience as an adoptee, quote, "For me, identity is probably particularly interesting because from the word go, you have two mothers and two fathers, and you immediately have an imaginary and a real mother. Your imaginary one being the birth mother, and the real one being the adoptive one. The opposite of what people say, I think." End quote. This has also been my experience. When I tell someone I was adopted, they usually speak of the parents who didn't raise me, the one I met for the first time at age 26, and the one I have never met, as the real ones. And they stumble over what to call the only people I have ever called, without qualifications, my parents. But what Kay's observation also opens up for me is the way that adoption, and in particular, the narrating of one's adoption, presents a fundamental problem of chronology. When does one's story begin? I naturally want to tell my life story from the point at which my life, as I have known it, began, such as with my earliest memories. Those are with my parents, the real ones, not the ones who were unknowable. What I've noticed, though, is that sometimes partway into that, a detail arises that requires explaining I was adopted, and then I must tell that story. I must start again. And what's more curious is that the listener is sometimes slightly affronted that they didn't get the real story first. Their confusion confuses me. I begin where I began. The story that you may want to call real came much later to me, emerging from the murk of speculation. So I tell my story to you in the order in which it came to me. Otherwise, I begin with haze, the haze that made me, sure, but one no less evanescent, a mist, the imaginary. In her memoir, Red Dust Road, Jackie Kay calls this ineffability a wind. And this is Jackie Kay again. My mom, all those years ago, sensed a child who had been adopted was also a child who could feel terribly hurt. And no matter how much she loved me, no matter how much my dad loved me, there is still a windy place right at the core of my heart. The windy place is like Wuthering Heights, out on open moors, rugged and wild and free and lonely. The wind rages and batters at the trees. I struggle against the windy place. I sometimes even forget it, but there it is. I'm partly defeated by it. You think adoption is a story which has an end, but the point about it is that it has no end. It keeps changing its ending. End quote. And then I add, I would also say that its beginning keeps changing, starting, halting, reapproaching. None of the generic, originary nodes feel correct. None encompass enough of the complexities. Truths spill over. It is unshorthandable. Every conceivable starting point leaves out something crucial that requires a different kind of entry altogether. And that's how I'm beginning this thing that might end up a memoir.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, it was exciting reading that because I dealt with that issue in Invisible Boy as well. There's a line in the book where I just kind of accounting for my birth mother's her experiences and the way that maybe, the trauma of that or the, like some part of that transferred to me, and I say, life begins half begun. It's really hard to know where you start. And I think that when you look into your own adoption and you start to rewrite your narrative, and I mean, for me, my life story it's kind of a counter narrative. I'm really looking at, where did I begin? Where can I start my version of my story? And so, I mean, my question to you, Jenny, would be like, did you think about that same thing? Do you think about when you started your beginnings, and how difficult was it to figure out how your book begins?
Mm-hmm. This is a really important question about genre, because when we write nonfiction, the assumption is that we're speaking about facts and we're telling the truth. That's the sort of unwritten contract between a nonfiction writer and its reader, or their reader, I should say. But for some adopted people, those stories are always changing. New information is always arriving that refutes information. So how does one write a memoir that's supposed to be about yourself when already that self is so fragmented and nonlinear? I decided to write in vignettes and out of order, which my editor kindly put in a certain kind of order. But I was very clear that I wanted the genre to reflect the feeling of unanchoredness and the feeling of inconsistency that has always sort of permeated my real life. And so the character, the speaker in this story also, is many people at different times and tells things out of order.
Do you think
things out of order.
Do you think that there's a kind of safety for you as a memoirist talking about your own adoption in presenting a story that is inconsistent, or that, presents a narrator that's
unreliable?
Yeah. I mean, because I feel like when I was writing Invisible Boy, I mean, that was a really conscious choice for me as well, to be like, look, this is how I remember it. I have ADHD, I have rejection sensitive dysphoria. My big feelings are bigger than most. And, I was able to kind of weave that into the narrative and give myself some distance and some cover. And I mean, reading Older Sister is not necessarily related. I mean, I was certainly struck by that kind of patchwork approach and, the ways that it gave you a kind of safety and distance.
Sure.
Okay. Wayde, to that same question, reading your essay, I was struck by how analytical it was. At times, kind of overtly anthropological. I wonder if, as you approach your own adoption, if that's a cover for you as well, just kind of giving an academic distance to your own story. Maybe I'm way off base. But
formally, that's one of the things that clicked when it finally started to flow, when I figured out something formally, and it was a braid. If you look at the essay, I go between three different modes of writing. One, I'm analyzing other people's writing about their adoption experiences. And then I move to a personal anecdote. And then I move to an analysis of my non-identifying information, the papers. So the whole essay goes between those three things all the way through from beginning to end. And so part of that's, trained in the English department, taught English for years before teaching creative writing. And so I'm comfortable doing exegesis and doing that with other people's writing, other memoirs. That's just fascinating because it's interesting seeing all the different experiences, yours included, and I'll read yours, and just seeing how different people approach just these things we're talking about. How do you write this down, and your personal circumstances? How do they represent themselves formally? That's just fascinating to me. And in some cases I could find things that were useful. I was like, that's similar to me, or that's something I recognize in my life, right? And so that would be helpful. And the personal anecdotes were the part that I think maybe you'd think of as a traditional memoir. It's really just me, but they're very fragmented. They come in the order of whatever, point that I'm making. I have a story from my life that illustrates that point. I think the earliest one is from just the years, the last years of my mom's life. And so they very much jump around. They're not chronological at all. And then me analyzing my adoption papers, I just thought it was an interesting thing to look at them as a piece of literature, because they're very much not. I mean, they're also fragmented and weird in their interviews with my parents and assessments of them, and then the strange information that they got from my birth mom at the time, the scant pieces of information I had. But looking at all of that as a piece of writing, looking at it as creative nonfiction, because in some ways it is. And some of it's, because, and it has an author. And the funny thing about my non-identifying information is that, and I'm curious if both of you have a relationship with that document. It's a weird document. So this is what I get through Freedom of Information. In my 20s, I wrote away, and they released this big package of all the bureaucratic information around my adoption to make it happen, but redacted of anything I could use to find my birth parents or any birth relatives. So that's all blanked out, which is very frustrating at that point. But it also tells the story, but in these documents, right? It's not narrative. But the name that they don't leave out, they don't redact, is the full name of the social worker who facilitated my adoption. And she's the author of, so when I was adopted and they sent me to my parents' home, they sent me with a little document that described why I was put up for adoption, which is a little 3-sentence story about my birth mother and father and the decision that they made, a little bit about their race and appearance and stuff. And so that's all I had, is like a sheet of paper. And I grew up with that. And anytime I asked my mom, I was adopted, what do we know about that? And she would say, well, let's look at that again. We'd look at that paper. Well, when I got my non-identifying information in my 20s and looked at it, I saw that that's the paper. That's the thing that mom used to show me. And then flipped the page and saw the interview that was done with my birth mother to make that document. So basically I saw the first draft and for the first time realized, oh, this was written by someone, right? And saw her name, her full name is there, and thought, wow, this woman she narrated me to myself.
Yeah.
And the weird thing is that she cleaned up the narrative. So in the original document, I mean, it's a long story, but they did not make a decision together to put me up for adoption. Whereas the thing that I got implies they did, right? And it was much more complicated and a lot was going on. My birth mother being pregnant, going back home to her family in Toronto, being basically disowned, and then coming back up to Vancouver. All this stuff was left out, right? And then even the racial stuff is talked about differently. Some of the wording is different. And so it's a weird, uncanny thing to kind of see your life in documents, but also to see the story behind the story. And then also I'll just add, when I met my birth mother, so a few years after getting those papers, I met her and we were just getting to know each other and talking. And at one point she said, well, what was it like, growing up? You grew up with quite a wealthy family, right? And I was like, no, what are you talking about? I grew up in East Van. My dad was a longshoreman. And she was like, oh, I thought your parents were lawyers, doctors or lawyers or something like that, professionals. I was like, no, why did you think that? And she said, that's what the social worker told me. So they told her that you have a choice. They said, we found 3 couples, a black couple, a white couple, and an interracial couple. And you can decide who he gets placed with. And she said, interracial couple. And they said, okay. And we'll make that happen. And they're wealthy and professionals and live in expensive part of Vancouver. And so she said, great. She's 19 years old. This is the story they told her in 1972 that she had in the back of her mind for years, which is made up. There's no way they would do this Goldilocks scenario of you getting to choose, you know what I mean?
Yeah, they chose the family that was just right.
So this was like the closed adoption era when So they're not malicious lies. They were little like, let's send both parties away with the best, cleanest version of the story. I grew up with the nice one where they made this rational decision for adoption together. She was sent away with this idea that she'd chosen the best path for me and she had that power, neither of which was quite the truth, right? So it's weird how that's a construction, right? And so to analyze that as a piece of writing is what I do, and treat it as like it's because I saw it suddenly as drafts, right? Drafts and final copies of the narrative of me, right?
Yeah, like it's about you, right? And it feels like that's totally something I would do. Just kind of, look at the language of it and the construction of it and focus on that instead of the fact that this is a false narrative about you that you have to contend with for the rest of your life. And I think about my when I got my own adoption papers and looked at my birth history, my birth father, his whole thing was written just he's just a cool guy, right? He's just a guy, he's local, he's nice, he's German, everyone's cool. And then, my birth mother, it was written my birth mother is a Negroid of African ancestry. It was just I know that the language had evolved at that point. So anybody using Negroid and African is just so far, removed from whatever progress we're making here. And it's a weird document for me to look at because it just feels so inhuman at times. It's this is my mom. You're talking about her like she's a gazelle or something. It's weird.
That was the title that I took as the quote from my papers, which is when they finally say I'm adopted. Her recommendation says, I'm pleased to recommend Mr. and Mrs. Compton as adopting parents for a mixed Negroid male child.
That's
that
weird.
Was the final point of the assessment.
Did you get your papers? Did you look at them? Were they also just quite weird?
Thank you. I snuck my papers. I went to my agency. I guess I've always been bad.
Oh yeah.
I'm having a revelation.
You're just a naturally rebellious.
I'm actually a bad person.
100%.
We weren't supposed to see our papers. I went to the agency and then I took them.
Just stole them in a cool movie?
When the social worker was looking in a different direction.
Amazing.
Joke's on me, they were in Korean.
What was that to get them oh, and now this makes me feel weird as a Korean adoptee.
Reminded I don't know my language. Great, thanks again. I'm hoisted by my own petard.
That sucks for you, that sucks.
But no, there was some information in English and there was some translated information. And what was interesting, because it volunteers at the adoptee guest house I was staying at who could speak English, is that they were noticing the inconsistencies between the languages. And it was the same thing. It was not exactly the same situation, but insistent on changing the narrative to voluntary surrendering. My mother did not volunteer, did not agree to this. And so it was very interesting. It was also interesting reading the sort of analysis of my Canadian family, particularly the reference letters and
it's just character references.
Mm-hmm.
Just so and so is real nice.
Yeah.
Weird.
But mostly, and earlier you mentioned the sort of unavailability of healthy white babies, which is an ableist notion also, that's very clear, in addition to being racist. Coming across a part where I saw my parents' preference for percentage of racial this and that.
Oh, wow.
And
what were their preferences?
I won't say I imply it in the book,
yeah, okay.
but it was incredibly disappointing.
Yeah.
I'll just say, and that's just something that, we've been sort of not talking about since I saw it.
Yeah. okay, like just the straightest question. What is it like to slowly realize that your adoptive parents are racist to you?
I don't know how to answer
Yeah.
that because I love them.
Yeah.
And I sent them a copy. We were chatting just yesterday, sort of about the panel, not really. And you mentioned today that you had a stack of your books and your mom didn't gesture to them or anything, or didn't acknowledge them. I sent a copy of my book a week before it was released to my Canadian parents. And I inscribed in it, I hope that you can see love between the lines that are here. Because even difficult things, or one of my colleagues does research on difficult knowledge, it doesn't mean that it's devoid of empathy and love, and asking difficult questions and seeing unattractive parts of each other doesn't erase care, but it complicates it, I think. So I'm not sure. I think that there wasn't any one moment when I realized that my parents were uncomfortable about race. It was just intuitive as a small child. I somehow knew that it wasn't a safe topic for conversation.
Yeah.
Yes. But we're it's much better now, to be honest. And I always say when people say, I'm going to write a memoir, and I'm like, don't do it. It's the worst idea ever.
Oh, thanks for that.
There actually has been a benefit in that my parents did read it. And I think understand, even though we don't have conversations about race still, I think they understand the person I became a little bit better. And it's also maybe made them feel a little bit absolved, because maybe they felt that some of the grief and sorrow that I went through was solely on them. And it isn't. It's like a whole sort of assemblage of things.
Kind of a result of the system and the...
Yeah, and my personality, and also, I mean, I hate to say it, biological stuff too.
Yeah.
That were a product of many different factors. I think that it's improved my relationship with my parents, actually.
I'm very jealous. I don't think my parents
I didn't think it would be that way either.
Yeah.
I'm not and I was very frightened, and I did make an editorial change because I told them so my mother still tells everyone it's a novel.
It's made up. It's mostly made up. It's guesses.
All of a sudden, she's like a literature expert and knows the difference between a memoir and a novel. But I did remove something, and it changed the entire structure of the book because my Canadian parents asked me not to talk about something, and so I didn't because I do care about them.
Yeah. I really tried to avoid my adoptive mother while I was writing the book because I was really locked into the narrative I wanted to tell, and I knew that if she said, "Hey, don't talk about this," or "This would embarrass me," that I would capitulate. And it was really scary for me to talk about a lot of the things in the book because I felt like, she doesn't want me to talk about these things, and she doesn't want me to make her look like a racist. I worry a lot about that, and there are times that I feel really bad for my adoptive parents. Oh man, they could have adopted just about anyone, and instead they adopted this blabbermouth who remembers everything, and is going to write a book that people will read about how bad they were at this. I worry about that. I know that you kind of feel like you have license to tell this story now, but do you worry about that? Even as it sounds like you had a lot of really good and positive experiences, talking about your adoption in a way that acknowledges, say, trauma or loss or all of the other complex feelings that come with it, do you feel still like you have to make sure that you honor your adoptive parents, or make sure that the story doesn't make it seem like they did a bad job with you? I wonder what kind of responsibility you feel as you approach a memoir about adoption.
Well, it's interesting because for this essay, so it's going to appear in Brick magazine, where it's being edited right now for Brick, I think later in the year, or January maybe, December, January. So yeah, both my parents are dead, but my birth mother's alive. I've never met my birth father, but my birth mother's alive, and we have a pretty close relationship. I talked to her today. She lives in Toronto, so I don't see them as often as I like to, but whenever I'm there, I stay with my sister and I hang out with them, and that's great. So now, at this point, after all of this, she's the person I want to feel okay about this. So I gave it to her to read and said, just let me know what you think, and we talked about it afterwards. And she was great. So she's basically, I think on principle, she kind of said, it's your story, and you write whatever you want. Before she'd seen it, she said, that's your story, you write whatever you want. And I said, well, read it. Read it and then see. But she was fine with it. And then it just sort of was fact checking. I wanted to just make sure I had some facts right about things because I realized there was things that I was writing about that I remembered from 25 years ago when I met her, that we hadn't really talked about since, like some of the basics of what happened. She told me some things, little details, like my birth father drove a VW Bug, which I remembered, but then I thought, wow, I haven't talked to you about that in 25 years. Am I remembering that right? And she's like, yes, you got that right.
What color was it?
Little details. I don't remember the color.
Sorry,
But, so that's actually interesting in and of itself, that I've formulated enough of a relationship with her over these years that it's important to me that she doesn't feel hurt too. And
what was that like, forming a relationship with her? I had a chance to do that a little bit before my mom died this spring, and like I found it really scary. I found it. I felt like the just kind of like the attraction between her and I. Like this is my mom, and I want to like hold her and hug her, but I built up all these walls, and I also felt like, well, you can't just do that. You can't just be like, Mom, I love you. Like, you just met this person. You don't know what they're like. So like, I'm just wondering if you felt any internal resistance to developing that relationship, or just any unease about incorporating this kind of lost person into your life.
I got really lucky. I've just had luck through my life.
Lucky.
Hopefully it keeps going. But I've had some lucky turns and lucky breaks, and one of them is that she's really great and really was really forthcoming with questions I had, and was just a kind, gentle person. So no, it's been easy that way. The weird part of it was just, I think for both of us, we both, in the early days when we were just getting to know each other, like I didn't know, the first conversation I had with her, I didn't know if that would be the only conversation I would ever have. Yeah. So I thought she could just be, this is too much, and pull out at any minute. And, years later, she's like, oh, that's me too. Like I didn't know because I went to visit her shortly after we got in touch, and I stayed with her for a few weeks. And when I left, she was like, she wasn't sure if that trip would be the one time she ever sees me. And then I'm just gone, right? Yeah. But we're both like that. Yeah. So that was more of what it was. Not really a resistance, but I think both of a kind of like, maybe I get this one bit of you and that's it. It just felt like, and then we gradually realized, no, we both want to keep be in each other's.
You say gradually, did you feel any pressure to just kind of affirm her, like to just let her know, like, hey, like I'm not just here for a drive-by. I'm not just here to meet you and satisfy my curiosity. I want to build something.
Well, I think it was just getting to know.
The same question, so get ready for that.
It's like getting to know anyone. Like over time, you need to know a little more, and you need to build experiences together. And I think your book is such a great depiction of that, right? With your relationship with your sister, and I have a sister too, and that sibling relationship is so important too as part of this.
Yeah. I really want to reflect upon what you say about the risking or the feeling of riskiness and the desire for attachment and the fear of rejection or like the one time. Because, and I think this is what your question was also getting at, Harrison, is like, how do you act around these people? If it is the one time, like, do you just like ask a million questions, or is that going to come off as like creepy and too forward? Yeah. It's really difficult to navigate how those relationships are going to unfold, and in my case, my mom at the time that I met her was with someone who didn't approve of me, and so she had to like secretly meet up with me in different like clandestine ways. But then when I met my father, he kind of came at me, like he found out through the agency that I was in Korea, and I said I didn't want to meet him, but he like insisted. Because like one thing, sorry, remind me to come back to this, but that this is a book about gender and sexuality. And adoption just happens to be the frame for it. So I'm going to say that. But my father sort of came at me, and then my parents broke up with their respective spouses and got back together while I was there, all within a week. And so it's so Korean, right? Yeah, like it's so dramatic. Like, nothing's done halfway. So I encouraged that relationship though, because I felt that was my way of like solidifying and holding on, but I was wrong about that. And it's hard because those sibling relationships are so meaningful because it's like a lateral relationship. It's complicated also because when I was meeting one of my brothers, I felt uncomfortable, and with my dad also, because like typically when I want to lure a man towards me, I would deploy certain tactics, and I found myself doing that with like my biological kin. So yeah, sorry, I've gone off on like a really weird Freudian journey.
No, that's like, I'm going to steal your microphone. Yes, that's something that like I also, like I'm still not quite sure how to talk about, right? Like meeting my mom, yeah, like the attraction was, it was different. Like it just felt like, okay, well this is an attraction, but yeah, I'm a man from here. I really only know how to view this through a sexual lens, but it's not sexual. Like it's this weird, deeper thing, and like I felt like it was really terrifying. And so it was, I kept trying to assure my mom, like, hey, we're gonna hang out all the time. But at the same time, I was like, ooh, like I don't know what to do with these feelings. I've never experienced love at first sight, or just like the need to be close to someone. It was embarrassing. It still feels embarrassing to talk about. I mentioned to you the other day, like I saw a Law and Order episode about it, and it was so lurid, and it just was like, yeah, that's about where we are in the discourse when we're talking about this sort of reunion and these feelings. Yes.
The Jackie Kay memoir is so interesting for that, because she finds her birth father and goes to Nigeria and finds him, but he's a pastor of some kind, right? And so he's had her out of wedlock, and his flock don't know this. So he's all about connecting with her, but it's got to be on the down low. And so she at a certain point is like, I feel like we're cheating. Like there's this weird, I feel like his mistress or something, but it's just because he's not introducing her to all the important people in his life and all of this. It's just weird. Anyway, I just thought of that. Yeah, no, that's just so complex. And how do you deal with that as an adoptee? And again, I mean, for me, it was like, I don't really have anyone I can talk to about this. And I already feel, like I'm cheating on my adoptive mom. And then you get there and you have these
weird feelings. You're like, well, I don't know what to do with this. I found it just terrifying and really discombobulating, and I'm sure that you guys relate to that. Yes. We're like half an hour over. Oh, really? Can we talk forever? Is that? I would like that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Prep yourselves. We'll do some Q&A here if you. You can leave whenever. I do not care.
We've got probably 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. You just say whatever you were going to say. Disregard time, as I often do.
I was just going to add that a further complexity, but maybe saving piece was that I didn't speak the same language as any of these people. And so trying to express, I love you, I need you, I want you, it's okay, without words, and not being too creepy that you scare people away. Like it becomes like very tricky, that dance. And like to touch, because you can't speak. What does that mean? And in Korea, like people go to the naked spa together a lot, and I didn't want to. So she felt like really rejected by that. Like it's just, there are a lot of things that that made building that relationship more difficult, I think, than it had to be beyond the going through these Freudian stages when we're adults.
Want me to tell you later about my experience at the naked spa in Korea? Because it
I'd
was
rather not.
life-changing. So weird. All right, do we have any questions? Anyone who's been sitting here that has questions? Anyone? No? Yes.
I'm just wondering, we're talking about the complexities of this, some of the criticism of these kinds of adoptions, and I'm wondering, society at large, that's sort of defined by whiteness and these kinds of things, how much is society listening to your stories, to this sort of, not the parents coming in and saving this child, but the complexity and the difficulties?
Anyone, do you feel listened to?
I mean, I do. I think for the most part, I think I've been shepherded in a very supportive way by my literary team towards events and interviews where people will listen to me. Because the other piece I think that you're hinting at here, or in this fabulous question, is that for people of color, but especially for Black and Indigenous people, but for people of color, and then for queer people and for women, there's a higher threshold for being believed. And so I think that I've been fortunate enough to be put in situations where I haven't been doubted as much. But yeah.
Yeah, I do get the sense that people want to get this. They want to wrap their minds around it. I've said to a few people, a lot of the folks who adopt children and especially who do transracial adoption tend to be pretty conservative. And one of the reasons for that is there's just this huge dilemma at the center of adoption, this question of, am I taking a baby? And am I equipped to raise this baby? This baby who will be an other and who will be separated from their family and their history and their identity. Is this okay for me to take this baby and say that this is my baby? And I think a lot of the times the people who adopt are the people who just kind of said, yeah, it's fine. So I know that there are a lot of folks who have unease with those questions and who never really solved that dilemma. And some of those people adopted, but they want to talk about it. They want answers and they want clarity. Nobody likes living in that gray area. I think that my book and your book that is coming, I'm so excited. They give people the opportunity to see it from our perspective and to just consider this on the complex, level that it needs to be considered. So, yeah, I mean, people have asked me since my book came out, like, oh, well, Invisible Boy, do you feel seen? Still no, but I feel like I've made a demand to be seen, and I feel like some people are really trying to see me, and that's really encouraging. I mean, that feels like a modicum of progress. It doesn't feel like we've gotten to the end of it, but certainly I think that people are trying to grow, and they're trying to learn, and they're trying to listen. And that is encouraging. I don't know if you have anything to add on this.
No, just the same thing, really. I mean, I think it was interesting as a project to read as many memoirs as I could of adoptees, right? And especially ones who are of color. So it's out there. People are writing about their experience. So there's no reason to not know. It's pretty easy to educate yourself about it. But then I don't know how we get from there to policy, or how we get from there to better policy. And that's not actually my area. So I don't know.
Do you have, this is my question, I don't know if anyone else has a question, but do you have a canned response for people that ask you what we should do differently about adoption, how we should fix it, how we should reform it? When that question comes up, what do you say?
People don't ask me that because I'm a woman.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So people don't ask me about how to make social change.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
So maybe you've received that question
Oh, yeah.
times. But people ask me about my feelings a lot. And
yeah, my sense is that people, I'll tell them my experience, and then they'll be like, okay, well, how would you fix it? I mean, that hasn't happened necessarily with this book yet, but I mean, that was certainly my experience growing up. You'd be like, well, this is weird. I don't think we should use that word or say that thing, or maybe you shouldn't have dressed as me in blackface for Halloween this year. And they'll say, yeah, well, what should we have done differently? It really stumps me, because I don't have answers to these problems. I just think they're problems. That's all I've got. I'm here to point out that these problems are problems, and then they want me to fix them for bringing them up.
for free.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's an unfair question, because they're asking for a consultation for free. And it's doing the autoethnographic is not really a comfortable place for me. So luckily I don't get asked that, because people don't think that I could have an understanding of social change.
I do. I want you to know.
Very sweet. But yeah, I don't feel it's my place to say.
If anybody asks you how to fix adoption, what are you going to say?
Oh, it's so complicated. I don't know. I mean, I know it's very complicated, but I mean, from my personal, that's all I know really is my personal experience. I'm glad they were trying to race match in adoption. And I think that is a good thing. It's not always going to produce the best outcome. Just like a transracial adoption is not always going to produce a bad outcome, but it just made a lot of things easier. It really did, which you don't know. I mean, that's the definition of privilege, right? Is that I wasn't exactly aware of that until I got older and met other people who were adopted into more difficult situations and didn't have that. So that's how it was an advantage, right?
Yeah.
So that should be continued where possible. And where not possible, I think, is those things that can fill it in, like community contact, in whatever natural way you can think of it, or open adoptions. That just seems to be common sense.
Yeah, I was saying it's over. We really did it, huh? Screw the pooch on this one. Okay, any other questions before we dismiss you? Wade, Jenny, thank you so much for being here. I really can't gush about how honored I am to be sitting between you two enough, like luminaries in the space I decided to work in. I look up to both of you so much. Oh my God, I could cry about this. Wow. And thank you to everybody who came here. I had so much fun with this conversation, and I hope that you did too. I guess we should say that we are finished. Oh, and applause.